Here's what the history books don't usually tell you. The Volkswagen Beetle, that cheerful symbol of 1960s counterculture, that beloved icon of affordable transportation, that car that supposedly brought motoring to the masses, was never actually meant for the people who built it. In fact, the workers who assembled the first Volkswagens never drove them. They paid for them, saved for them, dreamed about them, but they never received a single car, not one. Because the Volkswagen was never really about giving ordinary Germans affordable transportation. It was about something far darker. The name Volkswagen literally translates to people's car, but this wasn't a gift to the German people. It was one of history's most elaborate propaganda schemes, a promise that was never meant to be kept, a vision that served political ambitions rather than actual transportation needs. You see, when Adolf Hitler stood before crowds in the 1930s promising every German family an affordable automobile, he wasn't thinking about traffic congestion or family road trips. He was thinking about rearmament, about propaganda value, about creating an image of Nazi prosperity while preparing for war. The Volkswagen story is usually told as a feel-good tale. Visionary leader wants to motorize Germany, brilliant engineer designs, an affordable car, post-war recovery, turns it into global success. But that narrative carefully edits out the uncomfortable truth. The Volkswagen was a scam from the very beginning. And the most fascinating part? The car only became a genuine people's car after the Nazi regime fell, after the propaganda failed, after Allied forces took over the bombed-out factory. The Volkswagen succeeded in spite of its origins, not because of them. This is the hidden story nobody talks about. To understand why the Volkswagen was never meant to be a people's car, you need to understand Germany in the early 1930s. The country was still recovering from the catastrophic economic collapse that followed World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations. Hyperinflation in the 1920s had destroyed savings. The hyperinflation of 1923 had been particularly devastating. Money became worthless so quickly that workers demanded payment twice daily so they could buy food before prices rose again. Savings accumulated over lifetimes evaporated. The middle class was wiped out. The psychological trauma of watching money become worthless created deep economic insecurity that persisted for decades. The Great Depression hit Germany harder than most countries. By 1932, unemployment reached 30%. 6 million Germans out of work. Industrial production had collapsed. Banks failed. The Weimar Republic's inability to address the crisis opened the door for extremist parties promising radical solutions. The Nazis exploited this desperation masterfully. By 1933, when Hitler became chancellor, unemployment was massive and the German economy was broken. Most Germans could barely afford food, let alone automobiles. Meat was a luxury for many families. New clothing was saved for special occasions. The idea of owning a car seemed like a fantasy from another world entirely. Car ownership in Germany was approximately 1 vehicle per 50 people, far behind America, where it was 1 per 5 people, or even Britain and France. The automobile was firmly established as a luxury item for the wealthy, not transportation for ordinary citizens. Workers used bicycles, trams, trains, or walked. Cars were for rich people. The German automotive industry in 1933 reflected this reality. Daimler-Benz built expensive luxury cars and trucks. Opel, owned by General Motors since 1929, produced mid-range vehicles that were still beyond most workers' reach. BMW made motorcycles, and just beginning with luxury cars. Auto Union produced various brands serving different market segments, all expensive by working-class standards. These manufacturers had no interest in building truly cheap cars. Their business models depended on selling relatively few vehicles at high prices with good profit margins. The idea of mass-producing affordable cars for workers seemed economically irrational. The customers couldn't afford them, and the margins would be terrible even if they could. Germany's road infrastructure was also underdeveloped compared to America. The Autobahn network Hitler later championed didn't exist yet in 1933. Most roads were narrow, poorly maintained, and unsuited to automobile traffic. The infrastructure for mass motorization simply wasn't there, which made promises of mass car ownership seem even more fantastical. The automobile was a luxury item for wealthy Germans, a toy for the rich to show off on weekends. Working-class families used bicycles, trams, or walked. The idea of ordinary workers owning cars seemed absurd, not just economically improbable, but almost unimaginable given income levels and priorities. Why would a worker making 150 Reichsmarks monthly spend 1,000 on a car? Even the wealthy Germans who did own cars often employed chauffeurs. Driving was seen as a skilled task requiring training and attention, not something gentlemen did themselves. The cultural attitude toward automobiles was completely different from America, where Henry Ford had successfully marketed cars as tools for individual freedom and family mobility. Hitler had been fascinated by automobiles since before he came to power. During his imprisonment after the failed 1923 Munich Putsch, he'd read about Henry Ford and become obsessed with Ford's achievement in mass-producing affordable cars. Hitler saw automobiles not just as transportation, but as symbols of modernity and national strength. Hitler's interest in Ford went beyond automobiles. Ford's anti-Semitism and industrial success made him a hero to Hitler. Ford's book, The International Jew, was translated into German and widely distributed by Nazi supporters. Hitler kept a portrait of Ford in his office. The automaker represented Hitler's vision of modern industrial capitalism, directed toward nationalist purposes. Ford's Model T had accomplished something Hitler envied. It had motorized America and created a massive consumer market while making Ford enormously wealthy and influential. Hitler wanted to replicate this in Germany, but with the state directing the effort rather than private enterprise. The automobile would serve National Socialist purposes, not capitalist profit. When he became chancellor in 1933, Hitler quickly identified automobile production as a propaganda opportunity. If he could promise German workers affordable cars, matching or exceeding what capitalist America offered, it would demonstrate Nazi superiority. It would show that National Socialism cared about ordinary people in ways the Weimar Republic hadn't. It would be proof that the new regime delivered results. The propaganda value was enormous. Previous German governments had failed to address worker poverty, unemployment, and economic desperation. If Hitler could promise cars, the ultimate modern consumer product, it would show the Nazi regime was different, effective, and genuinely concerned with ordinary Germans' welfare. The promise mattered more than whether it could actually be kept. At the 1934 Berlin Auto Show, Hitler delivered one of his most important speeches regarding domestic policy. This wasn't a military or foreign policy address. It was about automobiles and German workers. The speech was carefully crafted to appeal to working-class Germans who might still be skeptical of the Nazi regime. Hitler announced his vision for a Volkswagen, a people's car that every German family could afford. He contrasted Germany's low car ownership with America's mass motorization. He claimed this disparity proved the failure of previous German governments and the superiority of National Socialist planning. The automobile became a symbol of competing political systems. The specifications were impossibly ambitious and clearly designed for propaganda impact rather than engineering feasibility. The car should cost no more than 990 Reichsmarks, about the price of a good motorcycle, roughly two-thirds of an average worker's annual income. It should transport a family of 5, achieve 100 kilometers per hour on the new autobahns, and consume less than 7 liters per 100 kilometers. These specifications were carefully chosen for maximum propaganda effect. The 990 Reichsmark price point was just barely conceivable for a working-class family who saved diligently. The capacity for 5 people meant entire families could travel together. The 100 kilometers per hour top speed suggested modernity and performance. The fuel economy meant operating costs would be manageable. Every detail was calculated for propaganda purposes. Hitler also promised to build a network of autobahns, high-speed motorways connecting German cities. These would serve military purposes by enabling rapid troop movements, but they were marketed as infrastructure for the people's car. The Autobahns and Volkswagen were sold as integrated vision, modern roads for modern cars, all thanks to National Socialist efficiency. The German automotive industry responded with skepticism bordering on hostility when approached about building Hitler's Volkswagen. Existing manufacturers, Daimler-Benz, Opel, BMW, knew these specifications were financially impossible. A car meeting Hitler's requirements would cost at least 1,600 to 2,000 Reichsmarks to produce, meaning it couldn't be sold at 990 without massive losses. The economics were simple and brutal. Materials cost money, labor cost money, tooling and factory construction cost money. Even with efficient production, economies of scale, and clever engineering, there was no way to build a 5-passenger car meeting Hitler's performance specifications for anything close to 990 Reichsmarks. The price target was pure fantasy. Daimler-Benz representatives explained this to Nazi officials. Opel engineers provided detailed cost breakdowns. BMW pointed out the impossibility. Every established manufacturer told Hitler's government that the people's car as specified couldn't be built at the promised price. They were all ignored. More fundamentally, these established manufacturers had no interest in building cheap cars for workers, even if the economics somehow worked. They made money selling expensive vehicles to wealthy customers. Creating an affordable mass-market car would cannibalize their existing business and establish a state-subsidized competitor that would undercut their prices. The manufacturers also recognized that Hitler's Volkswagen wasn't really about economics. It was about propaganda and political control. A state-directed automobile project would give the Nazi government enormous control over automotive production, employment, and related industries. Private manufacturers would lose autonomy and market power. This was economic nationalism, dressed up as worker welfare. Hitler didn't care about their objections. He wanted his people's car, and if existing manufacturers wouldn't build it, he'd create it himself. This is when Ferdinand Porsche entered the picture, and the Volkswagen story took its first truly dark turn. Ferdinand Porsche was already a legendary automotive engineer by 1934. He'd designed successful cars for Austro-Daimler, Daimler, and Steyr. He'd created racing cars that won major competitions. But his difficult personality meant he'd been fired from multiple positions, brilliant, but impossible to work with. In 1931, Porsche had opened his own engineering consultancy in Stuttgart. He'd already been thinking about small, affordable cars. In fact, he'd designed several prototypes exploring economical transportation, lightweight, air-cooled rear-engine designs that maximized efficiency and minimized cost. When Hitler's government approached Porsche about designing the Volkswagen, Porsche saw opportunity. Here was a project with essentially unlimited state funding, ambitious technical challenges, and the potential for enormous production volume. The moral implications of working for the Nazi regime apparently didn't trouble him. Or if they did, ambition won. Porsche signed a contract with the German government in June 1934 to design the Volkswagen. The terms gave him 10 months and 20,000 Reichsmarks to create 3 prototype vehicles. It was an impossibly tight timeline and a ridiculously small budget, but Porsche had been thinking about this problem for years. The design that emerged was brilliant from an engineering perspective. Rear-mounted, air-cooled, flat-4 engine for simplicity and low cost. Aerodynamic body, reducing drag and improving fuel economy. Platform chassis with independent suspension for good ride quality. Simple mechanical systems, easy to manufacture and maintain. Porsche borrowed ideas from everywhere. The rear engine layout came from Tatra, a Czech manufacturer that would later sue Volkswagen for patent infringement. The aerodynamic shape reflected extensive wind tunnel testing. The flat-4 Boxer engine was adapted from his earlier designs. Nothing was revolutionary, but the integration was masterly. The first prototypes, designated VW1 through VW3, were completed in 1936. They broadly met Hitler's specifications. They were small, lightweight, economical, and could reach 100 kilometers per hour. But they cost far more than 990 Reichsmarks to produce. The target price was pure fantasy, possible only with massive state subsidies and production volume measured in millions. Hitler didn't care about the economics. The Volkswagen served propaganda purposes regardless of whether the numbers made sense. At the 1936 Berlin Auto Show, the prototypes were displayed to great fanfare. Hitler personally test drove them and declared the project a success. The propaganda machine celebrated this achievement of Nazi engineering. But here's where the scam really began. In 1938, the Nazi government announced the KDF wagon program, Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy. This was the official name for the Volkswagen before it became simply VW. The program's name itself was propaganda. Strength Through Joy was the Nazi leisure organization that organized state-approved recreational activities for workers. The KDF organization controlled workers' leisure time, offering subsidized vacations, cultural events, and recreational activities. Everything was designed to keep workers content while extracting their labor for state purposes. The KDF wagon fit perfectly into this framework, a promise of future leisure, family car trips in exchange for present sacrifice, weekly savings payments. The program worked like this. German workers would save for their Volkswagen through a mandatory payment plan. Each week, they'd buy stamps worth 5 Reichsmarks and paste them into a special savings book. After collecting 990 Reichsmarks worth of stamps, about 4 years of weekly payments for an average worker, they'd be entitled to receive their car. The stamps couldn't be used for anything else and weren't refundable. Once you bought a stamp and pasted it into your savings book, that money was gone. You couldn't get it back, couldn't use it for other purchases, couldn't access it in emergencies. It was a one-way transfer of funds to the Nazi government with only a promise, not a contract, just a promise, of a future car. The savings books became symbols of hope and aspiration. Workers showed them to family members, counted their accumulated stamps, calculated how many weeks remained until they'd have 990 Reichsmarks. The books were tangible proof they were saving for something better, participating in Germany's modernization, becoming part of the motorized future. The propaganda surrounding the program was brilliant and relentless. Posters showed happy Aryan families in their Volkswagens, driving through beautiful German countryside on new autobahns. Children smiled from the back seat. Mother looked content. Father drove confidently. The images promised not just a car, but a lifestyle, a vision of German prosperity and modern family life. Nazi propaganda emphasized that this was unique to National Socialism. Only Hitler's government cared enough about workers to make automobile ownership accessible. Capitalist countries left workers to struggle while the rich enjoyed luxury. Communist countries promised equality but delivered poverty. Only Nazi Germany would give workers genuine access to modern consumer goods. The message was clear. Sacrifice now, prosper later. Save your 5 Reichsmarks weekly. Paste your stamps. Fill your savings book. And soon you'll have your Volkswagen. You'll be part of the motorized masses, equal to Americans in your access to modern transportation. You'll drive your family on vacations, exploring Germany's beautiful landscapes. Your future is bright because the Führer cares about you. Approximately 336,000 Germans enrolled in the KDF savings program between 1938 and the start of World War II in September 1939. These were ordinary working-class Germans, factory workers, clerks, civil servants, people with modest incomes who nonetheless scraped together 5 Reichsmarks weekly because they believed the promise. Think about what 5 Reichsmarks weekly meant to an average German worker in 1938. That was about 3–4% of weekly income for a typical factory worker. Not an impossible sacrifice, but not trivial either. That was food money, clothing money, money that could have gone to immediate family needs, but workers paid it, believing they were investing in their future. They dutifully bought their weekly stamps, filling their savings books, watching their 990 Reichsmarks accumulate stamp by stamp. Some workers were close to completion when World War II began. They'd saved for 3–3.5 years, hundreds of Reichsmarks invested, hundreds of weekly sacrifices. They believed they'd receive their cars soon. They received nothing. The social pressure to participate was intense. The KDF savings program wasn't technically mandatory, but Nazi Germany's social control mechanisms made refusal difficult. Your co-workers were saving for Volkswagens. Your factory had Nazi officials monitoring who participated in party-approved programs. Declining to participate could mark you as politically unreliable. Some Germans were skeptical from the beginning. The economics seemed dubious. The promises seemed too good. But expressing skepticism was dangerous in Nazi Germany. You learned to keep such thoughts private, to smile and go along, to avoid drawing attention by questioning official programs. Silence equaled safety. The money collected through the KDF savings program, over 280 million Reichsmarks by the time war began, went into state coffers. Officially, it funded factory construction. In reality, it funded whatever the Nazi government wanted. The money wasn't held in escrow, wasn't protected for savers, wasn't designated exclusively for Volkswagen production. It was simply absorbed into state finances. This was theft disguised as industrial policy. The Nazi government took hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks from workers with no intention of delivering the promised goods. The entire scheme was designed to extract resources from the population while providing propaganda benefits. The promise was the product. The car itself was never meant to be delivered. Because here's the truth. The Volkswagen was never going to be delivered to German workers. Not before the war. Not ever. The whole scheme was designed to extract money from workers while providing propaganda value. The cars would never have been produced at anywhere near the volume needed to fulfill the orders, even without the war. The factory being built to produce Volkswagens, near Fallersleben, in what's now Lower Saxony, wasn't really optimized for civilian car production. Its location, its infrastructure, its design all suggested military purposes from the beginning. This was a facility that could easily convert to military production, and that's exactly what happened. When war began in September 1939, all civilian Volkswagen production immediately stopped. Not a single KDF wagon had been delivered to the workers who'd been saving. The 336,000 Germans who'd paid into the scheme got nothing. Their savings essentially became forced loans to the Nazi war machine, never repaid, never acknowledged. The factory switched to producing military vehicles. The Kubelwagen, a military utility vehicle based on Volkswagen mechanicals, became the primary product. Later came the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious military vehicle. Both used Porsche's air-cooled engine and simplified mechanical systems. Perfect for military use, terrible for the workers who'd paid for civilian cars they'd never receive. Ferdinand Porsche thrived during the war. He designed tanks, consulted on military vehicles, and received substantial compensation from the Nazi government. The morality of working for a genocidal regime while designing weapons apparently didn't concern him, or at least didn't stop him from taking the work and the money. The Volkswagen factory used forced labor from concentration camps and prisoners of war. Thousands of people who'd never chosen to be there, who received no payment, who worked under brutal conditions. They built vehicles while German workers who'd voluntarily paid for Volkswagens received nothing. The irony was cruel and deliberate. By 1944, Allied bombing had severely damaged the factory. Production declined but never completely stopped. The Nazi regime needed military vehicles desperately, and the Volkswagen factory kept producing them even as Germany collapsed. When American forces reached the factory in April 1945, they found a partially destroyed facility and no civilian cars. The post-war period is when the Volkswagen story becomes even stranger and more ironic. The factory was in the British occupation zone after Germany's division among the Allies. British military authorities assessed the damaged facility and considered its future. The obvious option was dismantling it completely. Germany wasn't going to be allowed a strong automotive industry as reparations for war damage and to prevent future military capability. The Potsdam Agreement of 1945 specified that German industrial capacity would be reduced to prevent future military threats. Automotive factories could produce military vehicles and therefore should be dismantled or strictly controlled. The Volkswagen factory was damaged by bombing, partially destroyed, and associated with Nazi propaganda. Dismantling it seemed logical. Major Ivan Hurst, a British Army officer with engineering background, was assigned to evaluate the factory in June 1945. Hurst had studied mechanical engineering before the war and understood industrial production. He toured the damaged factory, examined the Volkswagen design, and saw potential where others saw only Nazi remnants. The factory was damaged but repairable. The roof had holes from bombing. Some buildings were destroyed. Machinery was damaged or missing. But the core production capability remained. With repairs and organization, the factory could produce vehicles again. The question was whether it should. Hurst saw several practical reasons to restart production. First, the British occupation forces needed vehicles desperately. Military utility vehicles, staff cars, and transportation for occupation administrators were in short supply. The Volkswagen could serve these purposes cheaply if production could be restarted quickly. Second, the factory employed thousands of German workers and supported tens of thousands more indirectly. Keeping it operating meant keeping people employed, which meant stability in the occupation zone. Unemployed Germans were a security problem. Employed Germans producing useful goods were an asset. Third, the Volkswagen design itself was better than Hurst had expected. The air-cooled engine, simple mechanicals, and efficient packaging were genuinely clever. Stripped of Nazi associations and propaganda, the car was a practical small vehicle that could serve legitimate transportation needs in a devastated Germany. Hurst ordered production of Volkswagens for British military use in late 1945. The cars were painted British military olive green, marked with occupation forces insignia, and used by officers and administrators. This kept the factory operating and workers employed. More importantly, it proved the design worked and could be produced efficiently. Production started slowly. The factory was damaged, supplies were limited, and workers were malnourished and traumatized by war and defeat. But gradually production increased. By the end of 1945, about 1,800 Volkswagens had been built, all for British military use, none for German civilians who'd paid into the KDF scheme. The irony was extraordinary. The car promised to German workers but never delivered to them was now being produced for British occupation forces. The same factory that had taken German workers' money and given them nothing was now serving the victorious Allies. The workers who'd saved for Volkswagens they never received were now building Volkswagens for British officers. The British government, now running the factory, faced a question: what to do with this Nazi-era facility long-term? The factory couldn't remain under direct military control forever. It needed to be transferred to German management, sold to a private company, or dismantled. But which option made sense? The British tried to give the factory away as war reparations. They approached Henry Ford II, offering him the Volkswagen factory at essentially no cost. Ford sent representatives to evaluate the facility in 1948. They toured the factory, examined the Volkswagen design, studied the business prospects, and concluded it was worthless. Ford's assessment was damning. The Volkswagen design was fundamentally flawed, they believed. The rear engine layout was unconventional and would never be accepted by mass-market buyers. The air-cooled engine was inferior to water-cooled designs and would create reliability problems. The car was too small, too basic, too unusual to succeed commercially. Taking over the factory would be throwing good money after bad. Henry Ford II reportedly said the Volkswagen isn't worth a damn. This assessment, however wrong in retrospect, reflected conventional automotive wisdom in the late 1940s. Rear engines were weird. Air cooling was for aircraft, not cars. The whole design seemed backward. No mainstream manufacturer wanted it. British automotive executives were similarly dismissive. Representatives from Austin, Morris, and Roots Group inspected the factory. All declined to take it over. The consensus was that the Volkswagen represented failed Nazi technology, that rear-engine designs had no future, that air cooling was a dead end. In 1948, the Volkswagen looked like a relic of a discredited regime, not the future of global automotive transportation. This rejection was one of the most consequential mistakes in automotive history, comparable to Kodak dismissing digital photography or Blockbuster dismissing Netflix. The Volkswagen would go on to become one of the best-selling cars ever made, generating hundreds of billions in revenue over decades. But in 1948, every major manufacturer who examined it concluded it was worthless. The factory remained under British control until 1949, when it was transferred to German management as part of the gradual restoration of German sovereignty. Heinz Nordhoff, a talented manager who'd worked at Opel before the war and had automotive industry experience, became the new director in January 1948. Nordhoff would prove to be exactly the right person at the right time. Heinz Nordhoff was 49 years old when he took over Volkswagen, experienced but not set in his ways. He'd managed part of Opel's truck production during the war but hadn't been a Nazi Party member. He understood mass production from his Opel experience, but wasn't wedded to American methods. He saw the Volkswagen's potential when others saw only problems. Nordhoff understood that the Volkswagen could succeed, but only if it shed its Nazi associations and became what it had never been. A genuine people's car sold at prices ordinary people could afford, delivered to customers who actually paid for it, marketed honestly rather than as propaganda. Everything about the car's image needed to change. Nordhoff transformed both the factory and the car. He implemented modern production methods learned from his Opel experience. He improved quality control obsessively, refusing to ship cars that didn't meet his standards. He established rigorous testing procedures. He trained workers to take pride in their work. He built a reputation for reliability, brick by brick, car by car. More importantly, he changed the marketing fundamentally. The Volkswagen was no longer the KDF wagon, no longer associated with broken Nazi promises, no longer propaganda. It was simply the Volkswagen, the people's car. Except now the promise was real. You paid, you received a car. The transaction was honest. The German people who'd lost their savings in the KDF scheme were never fully compensated. After the war, legal battles dragged on for decades. Some token payments were eventually made, but nowhere near the value of what had been stolen. The 336,000 Germans who'd trusted the Nazi promise lost their money, and most never received justice. Yet, somehow, the Volkswagen succeeded anyway. Through the 1950s, production increased dramatically. The Beetle, as it became known worldwide, transformed from symbol of Nazi propaganda to icon of German recovery. Exports grew steadily, first to neighboring European countries, then to North America, eventually worldwide. By the 1960s, Volkswagen was selling millions of Beetles globally. The car succeeded in spite of its origins. The 1950s transformation was remarkable. Production climbed from about 20,000 vehicles in 1948 to over 200,000 by 1953. By 1955, Volkswagen had produced 1 million Beetles. The factory expanded, new production lines were added, employment grew. The city of Wolfsburg developed around the factory, transforming from a Nazi-era construction project into a thriving industrial city. Volkswagen's export success began in Europe. The Beetle was affordable, reliable, and economical, perfect for post-war Europe, where fuel was expensive and incomes were modest. Dutch, Swiss, Belgian, and Swedish buyers appreciated the car's practical virtues. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. In countries recovering from war, working mattered more than glamour. The American market seemed impossible initially. Americans loved big cars with big engines. The Beetle was tiny, underpowered, weird-looking. Its air-cooled engine made a distinctive sound that Americans found odd. The rear engine layout seemed backward. Everything about it contradicted American automotive preferences. Why would Americans buy this strange little German car? But Volkswagen entered the U.S. market carefully and cleverly. Rather than competing with Detroit's giants directly, VW positioned the Beetle as an alternative for people who didn't want what everyone else wanted. The advertising was brilliant, honest, witty, self-aware. The famous Think Small campaign celebrated the Beetle's modesty rather than apologizing for it. Think Small, launched in 1959, created by Doyle Dane Bernbach Advertising Agency. The ads were revolutionary, simple, black and white photography, lots of white space, clever copy that acknowledged the Beetle's limitations while framing them as advantages. "It makes your house look bigger," one ad joked. Another honestly listed the Beetle's few yearly changes. None. The advertising worked because it was honest in ways automotive advertising rarely was. Detroit sold dreams, excess, status. Volkswagen sold practicality, economy, simplicity. The contrast was stark and appealing to buyers tired of planned obsolescence and manipulative marketing. The Beetle was refreshingly straightforward. American sales grew steadily through the 1960s. By 1968, Volkswagen was selling over 400,000 vehicles annually in the United States. The Beetle had become America's best-selling imported car, outselling all other foreign brands combined. In California especially, Beetles were everywhere, practical, economical, and increasingly fashionable. The irony is profound and multi-layered. The Volkswagen was created through a scam funded by workers who never received their cars, built in a factory designed for military production, associated with one of history's most evil regimes. Yet it became exactly what it was never meant to be, an affordable car that genuinely gave ordinary people access to motorized transportation worldwide, not just in Germany. In America, the Beetle became a counterculture symbol, embraced by people who rejected mainstream values. Young people who opposed the Vietnam War, questioned authority, and experimented with alternative lifestyles saw the Beetle as an alternative to American automotive excess. They painted Beetles in psychedelic colors, decorated them with peace symbols, used them to signal rejection of establishment values. The hippies who painted Beetles in psychedelic colors, who covered them with anti-war slogans, who drove them to Woodstock and San Francisco. These people had no idea about the car's Nazi origins, or if they did know, they didn't care. The car had been transformed in their minds from Nazi propaganda tool to symbol of peace, love, and rejection of militarism. The same vehicle, completely opposite meanings. Think about that cultural transformation. A car designed for Nazi purposes, promised but never delivered to German workers, built partially by forced laborers, becomes the chosen vehicle of American peace activists and countercultural rebels. The car designed to serve fascist propaganda ends up symbolizing rejection of authority and celebration of individuality. The irony is almost too perfect. The Beetle's mechanical simplicity contributed to its countercultural appeal. You could maintain a Beetle yourself with basic tools and minimal expertise. The air-cooled engine was easy to work on. Parts were cheap and available. This DIY-friendly character fit perfectly with counterculture values of self-sufficiency and rejection of consumer culture. Volkswagen's official position on this countercultural adoption was carefully neutral. The company benefited from Beetle sales to young Americans regardless of how they decorated their cars or what social values they represented. But VW corporate management in Wolfsburg must have had complicated feelings watching their product, rooted in Nazi propaganda, become a peace symbol. By 1972, the Beetle surpassed the Ford Model T as the best-selling car design in history, with over 15 million produced. This was a genuine milestone, marking the Beetle as one of the most influential automobiles ever made. Over 15 million had been produced worldwide across all factories in decades. The car Hitler had promised but never delivered had become genuinely accessible to ordinary people worldwide. The people's car became real only after the people who'd promised it were gone. The achievement was genuine, even though it emerged from false premises and broken promises. The Beetle succeeded because Heinz Nordhoff and his successors made it succeed through quality, reliability, and honest marketing. The Nazi promises were lies, but the post-war reality became truth. The car delivered what had been falsely promised. Ferdinand Porsche's role in all this remains controversial. After the war, he was imprisoned by the French for war crimes. His work for the Nazi regime, his use of forced labor, his designs for military vehicles, all of this caught up with him. He was released in 1947 after his family paid a hefty sum for his freedom. Porsche never expressed remorse for his Nazi collaboration. He returned to engineering, founded the sports car company that bears his name, and became celebrated as an automotive genius. The moral compromises he'd made were forgotten or forgiven. Success has a way of erasing uncomfortable history. His son Ferry Porsche and grandson Ferdinand Porsche both became titans of the automotive industry. The Porsche and Porsche families grew wealthy and influential, building empires on foundations that included wartime collaboration and appropriated labor. They rarely discussed this history publicly. The Volkswagen factory that had been built with such propaganda fanfare became Wolfsburg, now Germany's fifth largest city. The entire city exists because of the Volkswagen factory. Tens of thousands of people work there or in related industries. The economic impact is enormous, but the city's founding purpose was Nazi propaganda and military production. Today's Volkswagen Group is one of the world's largest automakers, encompassing VW, Audi, Porsche, Bentley, Lamborghini, and more. The company employs over 600,000 people globally across dozens of countries. Annual revenues exceed 250 billion euros, making it one of the largest corporations in Europe. It's an economic powerhouse that traces directly to Hitler's propaganda scheme and Porsche's engineering, to broken promises and forced labor. The company's global reach is extraordinary. Volkswagen Group vehicles are sold in nearly every country worldwide. The company operates production facilities on every continent except Antarctica. The brand portfolio spans from budget cars, Volkswagen, Skoda, Seat through luxury vehicles, Audi, Porsche, Bentley to exotic supercars, Lamborghini, Bugatti. It's an automotive empire built on foundations that include Nazi propaganda and wartime atrocity. The modern Volkswagen Group has, to its credit, been relatively transparent about its Nazi origins compared to some German companies that downplayed or ignored their wartime activities. Beginning in the 1990s, VW commissioned independent historians to research its wartime history, including the use of forced labor. This research was made public, acknowledging uncomfortable truths rather than hiding them. The research revealed that approximately 20,000 forced laborers and concentration camp prisoners worked at the Volkswagen factory during World War II. These people, mostly from Eastern Europe, many of them Jews, were worked under brutal conditions, fed barely enough to survive, housed in terrible facilities, and treated as disposable resources. Their labor built the military vehicles that German workers' savings were supposed to buy as civilian cars. In 1998, Volkswagen established a humanitarian fund to compensate surviving forced laborers. The initial amount was modest, 20 million Deutschmarks, but it represented acknowledgement of responsibility. In 2000, Volkswagen contributed to the larger German industry fund that provided compensation to all surviving Nazi-era forced laborers, not just those who worked at VW. This reckoning came late, more than 50 years after the war ended. Most forced laborers had already died. The compensation amounts were modest compared to what they'd suffered. But it was more than many German companies did. Volkswagen chose to confront its history rather than ignore it, acknowledging that the company's success was built partly on atrocity. Yet questions remain about the completeness of this reckoning. Can a company truly atone for its founding purposes? Can financial compensation decades later make up for slavery, starvation, and death? Can success erase original sins? These aren't easy questions, and there are no universally satisfying answers. The Volkswagen Group today is not the Nazi KDF wagon factory of 1940, but it's also not entirely separate from it. The connection exists, undeniable and uncomfortable. The issue of the German workers who paid into the KDF scheme has received less attention than forced labor, perhaps because it's less clear how to make it right. The 336,000 Germans who saved for Volkswagens, they never received, weren't victims of slavery or genocide. Their suffering wasn't comparable to forced laborers, but they were defrauded systematically by their government, and that fraud funded the factory that became Volkswagen's foundation. Legal battles over KDF savings lasted until the 1960s, with court cases trying to establish who owed what to whom. The courts generally ruled that Volkswagen AG, the post-war company, had inherited some obligations from the Nazi-era KDF project, but that those obligations had been largely extinguished by the war, occupation, currency reform, and German division. Compensation was minimal, token payments that didn't approach the value of what had been taken. Most of the 336,000 Germans who'd saved for their Volkswagens through the KDF scheme received essentially nothing beyond small symbolic payments. Some received vouchers worth a few hundred marks toward purchasing a post-war Volkswagen, a tiny fraction of what they'd paid originally, and requiring them to pay full price on top of the voucher. They paid twice for what should have been theirs once. The moral complexity here is real. These Germans believed Nazi propaganda and participated in a Nazi program. They weren't forced laborers or concentration camp victims, but they were also defrauded by promises their government never intended to keep. They saved their money in good faith, making real sacrifices, and received nothing. Does their participation in a Nazi program negate their victimhood by that same system? The Beetle itself was produced until 2003 in Mexico, making it one of the longest-running automotive designs in history. Over 21 million were built across all production locations and decades. The final Beetle rolled off the line in Puebla, Mexico, on July 30, 2003, more than 6 decades after the first prototypes. In 2019, Volkswagen ended production of the new Beetle, and its successor, the second-generation new Beetle, finally retiring the design entirely. The announcement was nostalgic and bittersweet, celebrating an icon while closing a chapter. No mention was made of the Nazi origins or the broken promises to German workers. So, why does this matter? Why dig into uncomfortable history when the Volkswagen became, eventually, exactly what its name promised? Because the truth matters. Because understanding how propaganda works matters. Because knowing that even beloved symbols have dark origins helps us think more critically about corporate and political promises. The Volkswagen story reveals something profound about propaganda and engineering. Ferdinand Porsche designed a genuinely good car, economical, reliable, cleverly engineered. But good engineering doesn't erase bad purposes. The car worked, but the promise was a lie. The design was honest, even when its intended use was dishonest. It also shows how products can transcend their origins. The Beetle succeeded not because of Nazi intentions, but despite them. When the propaganda was stripped away, when the car was actually sold to ordinary people at prices they could afford, when it delivered genuine value, then it became what it was always named, but never meant to be. This transformation wasn't inevitable. If the British had dismantled the factory, if no one had restarted production, if the design had been genuinely flawed rather than cleverly conceived, the Volkswagen would be a historical footnote about Nazi propaganda. Instead, it became one of the most important cars in history because post-war circumstances allowed it to fulfill the promise its creators had no intention of keeping. The lesson here isn't that everything works out eventually. It's that stated purposes and actual purposes often diverge, especially in propaganda. When Hitler promised German workers a people's car, he was making a propaganda promise, not a business commitment. The workers who believed him and paid into the scheme learned this painfully. Compare this to Henry Ford's Model T. Ford genuinely wanted to give American workers affordable cars. He paid his workers well specifically so they could afford to buy Fords. This wasn't perfect. Ford had major flaws as a person and employer, but the basic purpose was genuine. Ford wanted to sell cars to ordinary people and structured his business accordingly. The Volkswagen had no such genuine purpose initially. It was propaganda masquerading as industrial policy. The savings scheme was extracting money from workers, not preparing to deliver cars. The factory was designed for military conversion, not civilian production. Everything about the original Volkswagen was dishonest. Yet Porsche's engineering was honest. The design choices, rear engine, air cooling, simple mechanicals, reflected genuine problem-solving for affordable transportation. Porsche was designing a real car, even if the purposes it served were false. This is why the Volkswagen could succeed later when purposes changed. This creates a strange moral complexity. Can we celebrate Porsche's engineering brilliance while condemning his Nazi collaboration? Can we admire the Beetle as an automotive achievement while acknowledging it was funded through fraud? There are no clean answers here, just uncomfortable nuance. The Volkswagen's evolution also parallels Germany's post-war transformation. Just as Germany had to confront its Nazi past while building a democratic future, the Volkswagen had to shed its Nazi associations while becoming a global success. Both processes were imperfect, incomplete, but ultimately somewhat successful. Heinz Nordhoff, the post-war Volkswagen director, deserves credit for this transformation. He could have emphasized continuity with the Nazi-era factory, playing to nationalist nostalgia. Instead, he broke from that past, focused on quality and reliability, and built a new reputation. The Volkswagen succeeded because Nordhoff made it succeed on genuine merit, not propaganda. The contrast with other Nazi-era projects is instructive. Many Nazi technological initiatives produced nothing useful: the bizarre weapons, the impractical super projects, the ideologically driven pseudoscience. These failed because they prioritized propaganda over functionality. The Volkswagen survived because the engineering was sound, even when the purposes were corrupt. This raises questions about technology and morality. Is a technology morally neutral, or does it carry the intentions of its creators? The Volkswagen suggests both are true. The car itself was morally neutral, just metal, rubber, and engineering. But its original purposes and how it was funded were deeply immoral. The car could be redeemed. The original purposes couldn't. Modern Volkswagen's reckoning with this history has been selective. The company acknowledges the forced labor, the Nazi connections, the wartime production, but it rarely emphasizes the broken promises to German workers, the 336,000 people who paid but never received cars. That story is less discussed, perhaps because it's less clear how to make it right decades later. The legal battles over KDF savings lasted until the 1960s. Courts ruled that Volkswagen had inherited the obligations of the Nazi-era company, but that the obligations had been mostly extinguished by the war and post-war chaos. Compensation was minimal. Most of the 336,000 Germans who'd saved for their Volkswagens received little or nothing beyond token payments. Imagine being one of those workers. You saved for 4 years, sacrificing weekly to afford this promised car. You believed the propaganda, trusted the promise, did exactly what you were told. Then war came, your savings disappeared, the cars went to the military, and after the war you received nothing, while the company that took your money became wealthy. The betrayal was comprehensive. Yet many of those same workers, or their children, probably bought Volkswagens in the 1950s and 1960s. They paid again for what they'd already paid for once. The car they'd been promised and denied became available, for a new price, from a new management, in a new Germany. The irony must have been bitter. The Volkswagen story also intersects with broader questions about economic propaganda. The KDF savings scheme was essentially a forced loan to the Nazi state. Workers' money funded factory construction and military preparation. This wasn't unique to the Volkswagen. Nazi Germany extracted resources from its population in many ways, but it was particularly brazen because it was framed as giving people something rather than taking from them. Modern parallels exist. How many government or corporate programs promise future benefits in exchange for current payments, only to fail to deliver? The scale and evil of Nazi Germany were unique, but the basic scam, promise something desirable, collect money, fail to deliver, appears in many contexts. The Volkswagen is just history's most successful version. The engineering legacy of the Volkswagen is easier to assess than the moral legacy. The rear engine, air-cooled design influenced countless other vehicles. The platform chassis approach shaped automotive engineering. The focus on simplicity and maintainability set standards. Even though the Beetle design is now obsolete, its engineering principles influenced generations of cars. The Porsche 356 and early 911 were direct descendants of Volkswagen technology. Ferry Porsche explicitly designed the 356 using Volkswagen components. The engine, transmission, and suspension from the Beetle became the foundation for Porsche sports cars. The Beetle literally gave birth to Porsche as an independent manufacturer. Other manufacturers borrowed VW ideas. The rear engine layout appeared in the Chevrolet Corvair, the Fiat 500, and numerous others. Air cooling influenced engine design across the industry. The concept of a simple, economical, cleverly packaged small car became automotive orthodoxy. The Volkswagen's engineering mattered regardless of its origins. Today's electric vehicles show Volkswagen influence in unexpected ways. The focus on packaging efficiency, the emphasis on reducing complexity, the goal of making advanced technology accessible. These echo the original Volkswagen brief, minus the dishonest purposes. Perhaps the Beetle's real legacy is proving that engineering for ordinary people can be both technically sophisticated and commercially successful. Volkswagen's transition to electric vehicles has been faster and more committed than most traditional manufacturers. The ID 0.3, ID 0.4, and other electric VWs represent serious attempts to dominate the EV market. This commitment traces back to the Beetle's core idea: accessible motorization for ordinary people. Electrification is just the latest technical approach to an old goal. The irony extends here too. The Volkswagen, created through a scam promising affordable transportation, might achieve that promise more fully with electric vehicles than it ever did with internal combustion. EVs have lower operating costs, simpler mechanicals, and could genuinely make personal transportation more accessible. The original promise might finally be fully kept, 90 years later. But the uncomfortable questions remain. Should we celebrate Volkswagen's successes while acknowledging its origins? Should the company's Nazi past affect how we view its present? There are no universal answers, but the questions matter. History doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. The Wolfsburg factory, built on propaganda and forced labor, now employs thousands in decent jobs with good wages. The city exists because of Nazi ambitions, but it's now a normal German city with normal residents living normal lives. Can places be redeemed even when their origins can't be justified? Wolfsburg suggests yes, but the history remains. Ferdinand Porsche died in 1951, wealthy and celebrated, having largely escaped accountability for his Nazi collaboration. His engineering genius was real. His moral compromises were also real. Both facts exist simultaneously, and neither erases the other. History is messy, and people are complicated. The Porsche and Piech families, descendants of Ferdinand Porsche, control Volkswagen Group through a complex ownership structure even today. The company, built on Nazi propaganda, is still controlled by the family of the man who designed the propaganda's centerpiece. This continuity is remarkable and troubling. Modern Volkswagen has faced other scandals, most notably Dieselgate, where the company programmed vehicles to cheat emissions tests. Some observers noted the irony. A company founded on dishonest promises got caught making dishonest promises about environmental performance. The echoes of history suggested corporate culture might carry forward in unexpected ways. After Dieselgate, Volkswagen committed to electric vehicles with unprecedented investment. Perhaps this represents genuine transformation, or perhaps it's necessary business adaptation. Motivations matter less than results. If Volkswagen helps democratize electric transportation, that achievement stands regardless of why they pursued it. The Beetle's cultural legacy is separate from its corporate origins. For millions of people worldwide, the Beetle represents freedom, individuality, reliability, and charm. These associations are real, even if they contradict the car's origin story. Cultural meaning can transform over time, independent of historical facts. The hippies who painted Beetles in psychedelic colors weren't endorsing Nazi propaganda. They were rejecting mainstream automotive culture and embracing an alternative. That the alternative had Nazi origins was unknown or irrelevant to them. The car had become something entirely different in a new context. This is how symbols work. Their meanings aren't fixed by origins, but evolve through use and association. The Beetle started as Nazi propaganda, became a symbol of German post-war recovery, then represented 1960s counterculture, then nostalgic simplicity. Each transformation was real, even though all were connected to the same physical object. The same process might apply to Volkswagen as a company. It started as Nazi propaganda and a scam against German workers. It became a symbol of German industrial recovery, then a global automotive giant. Now it's transitioning to electric vehicles and trying to be a leader in sustainable transportation. Each phase is real, and each connects to what came before. Yet, the original Sing remains. The 336,000 Germans who paid for Volkswagens they never received weren't made whole. The forced laborers were compensated inadequately, and only after decades. The Nazi collaboration happened and can't be undone. Success doesn't erase these facts. It just makes them easier to ignore. So, what do we conclude? The Volkswagen was never meant to be a people's car in the sense that ordinary Germans who paid for it would receive it. It was propaganda, a scam, a broken promise. But it accidentally became a genuine people's car after the Nazis fell, because the engineering was sound and post-war circumstances allowed honest fulfillment of the dishonest promise. This doesn't make the story wholesome or uplifting. It makes it complicated. The Volkswagen succeeded despite being created through fraud. The car became beloved despite being funded by broken promises. The company became an economic powerhouse despite being founded on propaganda. All of these statements are true simultaneously. Understanding this complexity matters because it helps us think more critically about corporate histories, political promises, and propaganda. When someone promises something that sounds too good to be true, when the economics don't add up, when the stated purposes seem at odds with observable actions, these are warning signs that purposes might diverge from promises. The German workers who paid into the KDS scheme believed the promise because they wanted to believe it. A car for 990 Reichsmarks seemed achievable because the propaganda said it was achievable. The posters showed happy families in Volkswagens, so it must be real. Propaganda works by making people want to believe, then exploiting that desire. Modern marketing and political promises aren't equivalent to Nazi propaganda. Let's be clear about that. But the basic mechanism of promising something desirable, making it seem achievable, then failing to deliver or delivering something different, this mechanism appears across contexts and eras. The Volkswagen story helps us recognize it. The engineering lesson is different. Ferdinand Porsche designed a genuinely clever car. The rear engine, air cooling, and simple mechanicals were intelligent solutions to real problems. When those solutions were applied honestly in the post-war period, they worked. Good engineering transcends bad purposes, though it doesn't justify them. This is why we can simultaneously acknowledge Porsche's engineering brilliance and condemn his Nazi collaboration. The engineering stands on its own technical merits. The collaboration stands on its own moral demerits. Both are real. Neither cancels the other. History contains multitudes. The Volkswagen's transformation from propaganda tool to genuine people's car took decades and required fundamental changes in purpose, management, and execution. Heinz Nordhoff deserves credit for making the transformation happen. He took a tainted product from a discredited regime and made it genuinely serve ordinary people. That achievement matters. But the transformation wasn't inevitable. It required circumstances. British occupation keeping the factory alive. No other manufacturers wanting it. Nordhoff's management skill. Post-war German economic recovery. Global export success. Remove any of these factors, and the Volkswagen might have remained a historical footnote about Nazi propaganda, rather than becoming an automotive icon. So, when you see a classic Beetle today, you're looking at a complicated object. It's Ferdinand Porsche's engineering genius and Nazi propaganda. Its broken promises to German workers and eventual success in giving ordinary people affordable transportation. Its forced labor building military vehicles and hippies embracing counterculture freedom. All of these are part of its story. Every classic Beetle carries this history, whether its owner knows it or not. The cheerfully painted bug driven by a teenager in California, the carefully restored example at a car show in Germany, the rusted Hulk rotting in someone's backyard, each one connects back to Hitler's propaganda. Porsche's design, the KDF fraud, the forced labor, and the post-war redemption. The car cannot be separated from this history. Museums and collectors face interesting questions about this. When you display a Beetle, how much of this history do you tell? Do you celebrate the car's engineering cleverness and global success? Or do you emphasize its Nazi origins and the broken promises? Both are true. Both matter. There's no way to tell the story completely without making people uncomfortable. The name Volkswagen, people's car, was always half truth and half lie. The car was designed for people, engineered to meet their transportation needs, specified to be affordable. But it was not delivered to the people who paid for it. It was never meant to be given to German workers who saved their money. It was meant to serve propaganda purposes, then military purposes, but never its stated purpose until after those who made the promises were gone. This is perhaps the ultimate irony and the deepest lesson. The Volkswagen had to stop being the Nazi Volkswagen before it could become the genuine people's car. The promise was real only after the promisers were gone, only after the propaganda purposes failed, only after the war ended and new management with honest intentions took over. The name became true only after its original purposes were defeated. The transformation required stripping away the propaganda, abandoning the dishonest promises, and starting fresh with genuine business purposes, making good cars, selling them honestly, building a reputation through quality rather than marketing manipulation. Heinz Nordhoff understood this instinctively. The Beetle couldn't succeed while carrying Nazi baggage. It had to become something genuinely new while building on engineering that was genuinely sound. And maybe that's the lesson we should take from this hidden history. Sometimes good things come from bad origins, not because the origins were good, but because circumstances allow transformation. Sometimes products transcend their purposes. Sometimes engineering excellence can be redeemed from moral compromise. Sometimes promises are kept by people who never made them, for purposes completely different from what was originally intended. The Volkswagen was never meant to be a people's car, but it became one anyway, in spite of everything, because history is stranger and more complicated than propaganda, and perhaps that's a more powerful story than the sanitized version usually told. Not because it's uplifting, but because it's true.